The funeral ended before my grief ever really began. The last handful of dirt hit the casket with a dull final sound, and everyone around me started shifting, murmuring condolences, preparing to leave. I was still standing there, staring at the ground, trying to understand how 35 years of marriage could disappear into a hole in the earth. Margaret had been my constant since I was 25. I didn't know how to be a man without her standing beside me. That was when Lauren leaned in close enough for me to smell her perfume. "You shouldn't hold on to her things," she said gently, as if she were offering comfort. "It's not healthy. We should clear them out soon so you can move on." Move on. The words landed heavier than the dirt on Margaret's coffin. Her grave was still open. The flowers were still fresh. My hands were still shaking, and my daughter-in-law was already talking about erasing my wife from our home. I nodded because that's what people do when they're too stunned to argue. But something inside me tightened. Grief is slow. It drags its feet. It demands to be felt. And no one should rush the dead. That was the first moment I felt it. Not suspicion, not anger, unease. The kind that whispers instead of shouts. The kind you ignore when you don't yet understand what it's trying to save you from. The house felt wrong when I came back from the cemetery. Margaret's shoes were still by the door, her coat still hanging where she'd left it the night before she went into the hospital. The living room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the lavender sachets she kept tucked in drawers. Everything was exactly where it had always been. And yet none of it made sense anymore. I moved through the room slowly like a guest who wasn't sure he belonged there. Every object carried weight. The framed photo from our anniversary trip. The chipped mug she refused to throw away. The stack of mail she used to sort every afternoon while I read the paper. I sat down at the kitchen table and realized I'd made 2 cups of coffee. I stared at them until the steam faded, then poured one down the sink without tasting it. That was when I heard the front door open again. Lauren didn't knock. She never did. She came in carrying cardboard boxes, trash bags, and a roll of masking tape, moving with purpose like someone who'd already decided how the day would go. "I thought we could start small," she said, setting the boxes down. "Just the obvious stuff. Clothes, old papers. It'll be easier if we do it now. Now, again." I opened my mouth to say I wasn't ready, but the words tangled somewhere between my chest and my throat. Instead, I nodded. I told myself she was trying to help. I told myself grief made people act strangely. I told myself this was just a generational difference, that young people handled loss differently than we did. Lauren began sorting almost immediately. "Donate," she said, pointing to a pile of sweaters Margaret wore around the house. "Trash," she added, nudging a stack of old notebooks with her foot. She didn't use Margaret's name. She called everything this stuff as if it had never belonged to a living person. Each word felt like an erasure. I picked up one of the notebooks without realizing I was doing it. Margaret used to write grocery lists, in them notes to herself, reminders to call her sister. Lauren glanced at it and smiled, tight and polite. "She wouldn't want you clinging to things like that," she said. The certainty in her voice startled me. "How do you know?" I asked, before I could stop myself. She hesitated just for a second, then smoothed it over. "I just mean, it's what's best. For you. Best for you." It sounded rehearsed. By mid-morning, the house looked different. Empty in places it had never been empty before. Lauren moved faster the longer she stayed, as if racing against something invisible. I noticed she avoided the bedroom at first, circling around it, directing me elsewhere. Then she stopped in the hallway and gestured toward the door. "We should deal with the suitcase, too," she said. "What suitcase?" I asked. "The old one. In the bedroom closet. It's been sitting there for years. Might as well get rid of it while we're at it." My stomach tightened. Margaret wasn't sentimental about much, but that suitcase wasn't just storage. She'd kept personal things in it, items she didn't want disturbed. I knew, because she'd told me once, half joking, half serious, that if anyone went digging through it, she'd haunt them. "I'll handle that one myself," I said. Lauren's smile flickered. "Of course," she said quickly. "Too quickly. I just thought, never mind." She didn't push, but the air shifted. Something brittle settled between us. When she finally left that afternoon, promising to come back the next day to finish up the silence she left behind, felt heavier than before. I stood alone in the bedroom doorway, staring at the closet. Margaret's side was still neat. Mine was untouched. And in the corner, half hidden behind winter coats, sat the old suitcase. I didn't open it. Not yet. That night I slept poorly. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard dirt hitting wood. Every time I woke, I expected to hear Margaret moving around the house, humming softly, making lists in her head, the way she always did. In the dark, I replayed Lauren's words. Move on. Clear them out. Forget. Grief isn't supposed to feel like pressure. It isn't supposed to come with deadlines. And it isn't supposed to arrive carrying trash bags. The next morning, I woke with the same tightness in my chest and a new, unwelcome thought. If Lauren was so eager to erase Margaret's presence, what was she afraid I might find if I didn't? I stood in the doorway of the bedroom again, looking at the suitcase. It hadn't moved. No one had touched it. Yet it felt different now, like it was waiting. I told myself I was overthinking. That loss had made me paranoid. That not everything needed a reason, but unease doesn't ask permission. It doesn't explain itself. It just sits there patient until you're finally ready to listen. I didn't know it then. But that suitcase wasn't holding my wife's past. It was holding the truth. And once I opened it, there would be no moving on at all. The morning after the funeral, I woke up reaching for someone who wasn't there. My hand brushed the empty side of the bed, and for a few disoriented seconds, I thought Margaret had already gone downstairs. She used to wake earlier than I did, padding quietly into the kitchen, giving me those extra minutes of sleep she knew I needed. I called her name without opening my eyes. No answer. The silence rushed in all at once, heavy and absolute. I sat up slowly, the truth settling back into place like a weight I hadn't earned the strength to carry yet. The room looked exactly the same as it had the night before, her lamp, her book on the nightstand, her glasses folded carefully beside it. Everything was intact and nothing was right. I shuffled into the kitchen out of habit, filled the kettle, took down 2 mugs. It wasn't until I turned from the counter and saw the empty chair across from me that I stopped. My hands began to shake as I stared at the extra cup. I poured one out and left the other untouched, letting it grow cold. That was when the front door opened. Lauren didn't announce herself. She never did. She walked in like someone who already belonged, keys in hand, phone tucked under her arm, a practical look on her face that didn't match the quiet of the house. "I brought more boxes," she said, setting them down near the entryway. I figured yesterday was a lot. Today we can really make progress. Make progress. I nodded because nodding was easier than finding words that wouldn't crack apart. I told myself she was being considerate. I told myself she meant well. I told myself grief made me sensitive. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. Lauren moved through the house with confidence, opening drawers, peering into closets, making small decisions without asking me. She labeled boxes with quick, efficient strokes of the marker. Donate. Trash. Keep. The last pile was always the smallest. "This one doesn't need to stay," she said, lifting one of Margaret's scarves. "You won't use it?" I didn't answer. I was watching the way she handled things, how she didn't pause, how her hands never lingered. Margaret touched objects like they mattered. Lauren handled them like obstacles. By mid-morning, the living room looked stripped down. Familiar corners were bare. Shelves that once held framed photos and souvenirs now showed pale outlines where objects had been removed. Lauren stepped back and smiled. "See, already looks cleaner?" Cleaner wasn't the word I would have chosen. The room felt hollow, like someone had scooped out its center and left the shell behind. I caught myself staring at the hallway that led to the bedroom. "We should finish everything today," Lauren said, following my gaze. Dragging it out just makes it worse. Today I asked. She shrugged lightly. Why wait? It's healthier to move forward. There it was again, the insistence, the urgency, always framed as concern. I wanted to tell her I wasn't ready, that the pain hadn't even found its shape yet. That moving forward felt like betrayal when the ground over my wife's grave was still fresh. Instead, I said nothing. Lauren's phone buzzed. She checked it quickly, her thumb flying across the screen, then slipped it back into her pocket. Is my son coming by? I asked. She didn't look at me when she answered. He thought it might overwhelm you. He didn't want to intrude. The words landed wrong. My son had never worried about intruding on my grief before. He would have shown up awkward and unsure, but present. Now he was absent, filtered through his wife. Everything came through Lauren. I let it go, but the realization stayed with me, sharp and uncomfortable. She moved toward the bedroom at last, stopping just inside the doorway. We'll do this room last, she said. It's the hardest. Hardest for whom I wondered. She began gathering clothes from Margaret's side of the closet, folding them with practiced efficiency. Each item disappeared into a box without ceremony. When she reached for a cardigan Margaret wore almost every evening, I spoke before I could stop myself. Leave that. Lauren's hands froze mid-fold. Why, she asked, her tone still calm, still polite. Because I said, searching for a reason that felt solid enough to stand on. Because I want to. The silence stretched. Lauren studied my face as if reassessing something. Of course, she said, finally forcing a smile. I just didn't want you holding on to things that would make this harder. Harder. Always harder. As if pain was something to be managed, minimized, erased on a schedule. She moved away from the closet and gestured toward the corner where the old suitcase sat half hidden behind coats. And that, she said casually. We should really deal with that today. My chest tightened. I told you, I said more firmly this time. I'll take care of it. Lauren laughed softly, a sound that didn't reach her eyes. You're overthinking it. It's just a bag. Just a bag. Margaret had never called it that. Lauren's smile wavered, then vanished altogether, for a fraction of a second. The look that replaced it was sharp, calculating. It was gone almost as soon as it appeared, smoothed over by practiced warmth. Whenever you're ready, she said. I just don't want it sitting around. Why not? The question pulsed in my head, but I didn't ask it. Not yet. Lauren left shortly after, saying she'd be back the next morning to finish. The house felt bruised in her absence. Boxes lined the walls. Empty spaces stared back at me. I wandered from room to room, touching things she hadn't gotten to yet. A photo album. A drawer of old letters. The objects felt heavier now, like they were resisting something. By evening, exhaustion settled into my bones. I sat in the living room surrounded by boxes that felt like accusations. Grief is supposed to make you tired. It's supposed to slow you down. This felt different. This felt like being rushed towards something I couldn't see. I stood in the bedroom doorway one last time before bed. The suitcase remained untouched exactly where it had been all day. Lauren had avoided it after our exchange, circling around it like a boundary she didn't want to cross openly. I stared at it, trying to understand why that mattered. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it was just another object my mind had latched onto because everything else felt unsteady. Maybe grief was playing tricks on me. But as I turned out the light, one thought refused to leave me alone. Lauren wasn't just trying to help me let go. She was trying to control the timing. And people who rush the grieving aren't afraid of sorrow. They're afraid of what grief might uncover if you're given time to look. The house finally went quiet, in a way it hadn't since Margaret died. Not the polite quiet that follows condolences, or the strained quiet that comes when people are trying not to say the wrong thing. This was deeper. Final. The kind of silence that settles after everyone has left and nothing is expected of you anymore. I stood in the hallway long after Lauren's car disappeared down the street, listening to the absence of her voice, the absence of pressure. For the first time since the funeral, no one was telling me what needed to be done next. I exhaled slow and shaky, as if I'd been holding my breath for days without realizing it. The bedroom door stood half open. I hadn't crossed that threshold since Margaret died. I'd slept on the couch the last 2 nights, telling myself it was temporary, that I just needed time. The truth was simpler and harder. I wasn't ready to step back into the space where everything still smelled like her. But that evening, my feet carried me forward anyway. The room was unchanged. Her side of the bed was neatly made, the quilt smoothed flat, as if she might return at any moment. Her lamp sat untouched. Her reading glasses rested on the nightstand, folded carefully exactly where she'd left them the night before she went into the hospital. I closed my eyes and breathed in. Lavender, soap, the faintest trace of her perfume. Grief hit me then, sudden and sharp, pressing against my chest, until my hands curled into fists. For a moment, I thought I might turn around and leave, retreat back into the safety of avoidance. That would have been easier. That would have been familiar. Instead, I stepped fully into the room. The closet door was ajar. Lauren had started there, but hadn't finished. Margaret's clothes hung in quiet rows, untouched by the boxes she'd so efficiently filled earlier. At the back, half-shadowed, sat the old suitcase. It wasn't large. It wasn't special. The leather was scuffed, the corners worn down from years of use. Margaret hadn't traveled much in the last decade, but she'd kept that suitcase anyway, tucked away, like something that still mattered even if it wasn't needed anymore. Lauren had wanted it gone. The thought tightened something in my gut. I knelt and pulled it out slowly, the wheels making a soft, reluctant sound against the floor. Dust coated the bottom. No one had moved it in a long time. I rested my hand on the handle and stopped. Guilt washed over me, unexpected and heavy. This felt wrong, like trespassing. Margaret had been private in quiet ways. She didn't hide things, but she didn't broadcast them either. I'd never gone through her personal belongings without her permission. "What are you hiding, Maggie?" I murmured, my voice barely more than a breath. The idea that she might have hidden something from me felt like a betrayal. We'd shared everything. Or at least I'd believed we had. I paced once around the room, then returned to the suitcase. My fingers trembled as I reached for the zipper. I stopped again. Maybe Lauren was right. Maybe this was just grief looking for meaning where there was none. Maybe I was about to invent a mystery because reality was too empty to accept. I almost walked away. What stopped me wasn't curiosity. It was memory. Margaret's voice, calm and deliberate from years earlier when we'd argued about something trivial, I no longer remembered. "If something ever feels wrong," Elias, she'd said, "don't ignore it just because it's uncomfortable." My hand moved on its own after that. The zipper slid open with a soft metallic sound, louder in the quiet room than it had any right to be. Inside, the suitcase wasn't filled with clothes. Not folded sweaters or old shoes or forgotten souvenirs. It was organized. Neatly stacked folders, a few envelopes, a small fabric pouch tucked into one corner. Everything arranged with care, as if Margaret had wanted whoever opened it to understand that this wasn't accidental. My heart began to pound. I lifted the top folder, my hands suddenly clumsy. Inside were papers I recognized immediately, bank statements. Not the casual kind that arrived in the mail and got tossed into a drawer, but printed records highlighted and annotated in Margaret's careful handwriting. I flipped through them slowly, my breath shallow. Dates, amounts, notes in the margins. This wasn't clutter. This wasn't memorabilia. This was evidence. I set the folder down and reached for the envelopes beneath it. One was labeled in Margaret's handwriting, small and precise. For Elias. My throat tightened. I opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, the loops and slants I'd seen on grocery lists, birthday cards, notes she'd left on the fridge. Elias, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to explain everything. Please don't panic. Please don't confront anyone yet. Check the suitcase carefully. The truth is inside. I had to sit down. The bed creaked beneath my weight as the room tilted, the words blurring in front of me. Margaret wasn't speculating. She wasn't venting fears or writing in confusion. She had expected this moment. She had prepared for it. I reread the note twice, 3 times, searching for comfort, for reassurance, for anything that told me I was misunderstanding. There was none. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and leaned forward again. Beneath the envelope sat a small USB drive taped to a piece of cardboard. Margaret had written on it, too. In case. In case of what Margaret had never been comfortable with technology. She used her phone, reluctantly asked me for help with the television remote, and still preferred handwritten notes to digital reminders. She wouldn't have saved anything on a USB drive unless it mattered, unless it frightened her. I held it between my fingers, feeling its solid weight, and something cold slid through my chest. This wasn't about grief anymore. This wasn't about memory or moving on. Margaret hadn't been preserving the past. She had been preparing for exposure. I continued sorting through the contents, my movements slow, deliberate. More documents. Copies of forms I recognized from our financial files. Some with Margaret's notes scribbled angrily in the margins. Others with dates circled, questions written beside them. Why this account? I didn't sign this. Ask Elias. Each note felt like a voice reaching up from the page, trying to get my attention before it was too late. At the bottom of the suitcase, beneath everything else, lay a thin notebook. Its cover was plain, unmarked. When I opened it, the pages were filled with short entries, uneven spacing sentences, sometimes trailing off as if Margaret had been interrupted. Today, she insisted again. I feel foolish writing this down. Something isn't right. My hands shook harder now. I closed the notebook and sat there, surrounded by the pieces of a life I hadn't fully seen. The room felt different. Smaller, unsafe in a way it never had before. Margaret had lived here. She had laughed here. She had slept beside me every night. And at some point, quietly, she had become afraid. I thought of Lauren's urgency, her insistence, her need to clear things out quickly, efficiently, before I could linger too long over anything that mattered. The pieces began to align in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. I closed the suitcase gently, not zipping it shut. It felt wrong to seal it again, as if doing so would trap Margaret's voice inside. I sat there for a long time, staring at it, listening to the house breathe around me. Whatever was in that suitcase, Lauren hadn't wanted me to see it. And Margaret had trusted that I would. The realization settled slowly, painfully. I was no longer just a widower sorting through his wife's belongings. I was standing at the edge of something that could unravel my family completely. And once you see that kind of truth, you don't get to close the suitcase and pretend you never opened it. I didn't plug in the USB drive right away. I sat there on the edge of the bed, the suitcase open at my feet. Margaret's handwriting staring up at me from every direction. My first instinct was to close it all, to put everything back exactly where it had been, as if I could rewind the moment and return to ignorance. Whatever this was, it was too big to take in all at once. But Margaret hadn't left this for me to admire. She'd left it because she ran out of time. I carried the suitcase into my study and locked the door behind me. The room smelled faintly of old books and dust, familiar and safe. I set the USB drive on the desk and stared at it for a long moment. My reflection warped on its smooth surface. This better be worth it, I whispered, though I didn't know who I was talking to anymore. The computer hummed to life. My fingers hesitated, then moved. When the drive finally opened, 3 folders appeared on the screen. Financial, medical notes. My heart began to race. I clicked on notes first, afraid of what the others might contain. A list of dated entries appeared typed this time, not handwritten. Margaret must have switched formats when she realized the seriousness of what she was documenting. The first entry was months old. I didn't mean to start this. I'm not paranoid. But something feels off, and I can't ignore it anymore. I scrolled. Lauren keeps insisting I rest. Keeps offering to handle things. She watches too closely when Elias isn't around. My throat tightened. Another entry. She suggested new supplements today. Said they'd help with my fatigue. I checked the bottle later. Prescription, not mine. I sat back in my chair, the air leaving my lungs all at once. Margaret had been sick, yes. Weak at times, but she had always managed her own medications. Always. The idea that someone else had inserted themselves into that part of her life made my skin crawl. I clicked into the medical folder next. Scanned documents filled the screen, photos of pill bottles, dosage schedules, notes typed in the margins. This was no casual record. Margaret had tracked changes, dates when pills were added or removed, times when Lauren had been present, questions written in bold. Why is this necessary? Not prescribed by Dr. Henson. Ask Elias. My chest burned as I read. I remembered Lauren hovering in the kitchen, gently insisting Margaret sit down, offering her water tea pills. I had thanked her at the time. I had been grateful someone was helping. I hadn't asked questions. I moved to the financial folder last. That one broke something open inside me. Bank statements filled the screen, neatly arranged. Our joint account, Margaret's personal savings, the retirement fund we'd planned to touch only when we truly needed it. Amounts were highlighted in yellow. Withdrawals I didn't recognize, small enough to slip by unnoticed, large enough to matter over time. Notes appeared beside them, authorized by whom signature doesn't match. Lauren suggested this. I leaned forward, my palms flat against the desk, breathing hard. Margaret had always handled our finances meticulously. She knew every dollar, every account. If she was questioning signatures, questioning authorization, something was very wrong. One document stopped me cold. A scanned form bearing my name. My signature. Except it wasn't my signature. The shape was wrong. The slant unfamiliar. Someone had copied it badly. I stared at it until my vision blurred. Margaret had circled it in red and written a single word beside it. Forgery. The room felt smaller with every breath I took. This wasn't misunderstanding. This wasn't family tension or generational difference. This was systematic, deliberate, planned. I scrolled back to the notes folder and opened a later entry, dated only weeks before Margaret died. I'm running out of time. I can feel it. Not physically, something else. Pressure? Everywhere. She wants things settled quickly. She wants control. I need to make sure Elias sees this if anything happens. My hands shook so badly I had to grip the edge of the desk. If anything happens. I had brushed off Margaret's worries so many times. Told her she was tired. Told her she was stressed. Told her Lauren meant well. The guilt came in waves, sharp and relentless. I clicked on the final entry. I've hidden everything in the suitcase. Elias never looks there. If you're reading this, please be careful. Don't confront her alone. Don't let her rush you. She wants decisions made while you're grieving. I closed my eyes. That was why. That was why Lauren had been so insistent. Why she'd pushed to clear everything out immediately. Why she'd wanted the suitcase gone before I'd even had time to breathe. Margaret hadn't just been documenting concerns. She'd been protecting me. I sat back staring at the darkened screen, the house suddenly feeling hostile in a way I couldn't explain. Every memory twisted under this new light. Every kind gesture from Lauren replayed with sharper edges. The way she'd insisted on managing appointments. The way she'd redirected conversations. The way she'd spoken for my son, spoken for me. I thought of the pills, the forged signature, the money, and beneath it all, the steady pressure. Move on. Clear it out. Decide now. Margaret had been standing in the way. I shut the laptop and sat in silence, listening to my own breathing, to the distant hum of the refrigerator, to the tick of the clock on the wall. Each sound felt amplified, intrusive. This wasn't something I could unsee, but it also wasn't something I could confront head-on. Not yet. Margaret had been clear about that. Don't confront her alone. I gathered the documents carefully, returning them to the suitcase exactly as I'd found them. I zipped it shut and slid it back into the closet, pushing coats in front of it until it was hidden again. Lauren couldn't know. Not yet. I wiped my face and went to the bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I looked older than I had a week ago. Hollowed out. Awake in a way that had nothing to do with rest. "Get yourself together," I said softly. That afternoon, Lauren called. "Just checking in," she said brightly. "How are you holding up?" Her voice sounded different now, thinner, calculated. "I'm managing," I replied, keeping my tone even. "Good," she said. "I'll come by tomorrow and we can finish up. No need to drag this out, right?" I closed my eyes. "Tomorrow's fine," I said. After I hung up, my hands were steady. Margaret had done the hard part already. She'd gathered the truth piece by piece, quietly, patiently, while pretending everything was normal. Now it was my turn. I wasn't grieving blindly anymore. I was watching. And Lauren had no idea that the house she was trying to strip clean had already given me everything I needed to stop her. I stopped guessing the moment I spread Margaret's papers across my desk. Not in a dramatic way. No sudden clarity, no cinematic rush. Just a quiet decision settling into place as I aligned stacks of documents by date and account. Guessing had emotions in it. Guessing was dangerous. Data wasn't. Margaret had left breadcrumbs, not conclusions. She hadn't accused anyone outright. She'd asked questions, circled numbers, flagged inconsistencies. She trusted that if I saw the full picture, I would do what she couldn't finish. I started with the bank statements. Our joint checking account sat in one pile, the retirement account in another. A smaller savings account I rarely looked at went beside them. I moved slowly, methodically, highlighting the same way Margaret had. Patterns emerged the way they always do when you stop hoping they won't. Withdrawals, regular, predictable. Always below the amount that would trigger alerts. Always spaced just far enough apart to avoid suspicion. At first glance, they looked like household expenses. At second glance, they looked like planning. I wrote the dates down in a notebook, my handwriting stiff and unfamiliar. Then I added notes in the margins. Why now? Why this account? Who authorized? The answers didn't come, but the shape of the problem did. The withdrawals began shortly after Margaret's health declined. Not when she was diagnosed, but when she started needing help with daily routines. When appointments multiplied. When she trusted others to step in. The amounts increased slowly. Not greedily. Cautiously. Whoever did this didn't want to be noticed. I cross-referenced the statements with our retirement account. That's when my chest tightened. Money had moved from one account to another in ways that made no sense for us. Transfers we hadn't discussed, adjustments we hadn't planned. Margaret had starred several of them and written the same phrase beside each. Ask Elias. I swallowed hard. She'd wanted to ask me. She'd meant to, and something had stopped her. I moved on to the documents Margaret had scanned. Forms with my name printed neatly at the top. My address, my identification number, my signature at the bottom. Except it wasn't mine. I pulled out an old document from our filing cabinet, something I'd signed years ago. I laid it beside the scan on my desk and compared them carefully. The difference was subtle but undeniable. The angle of the E, the pressure on the final stroke. Whoever forged it had practiced, but not enough. Margaret had written beside the scan in tight, angry script. Not his hand. The room felt colder. Forgery wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't stress or miscommunication. It was a crime. and it meant someone believed they had the right to act in my name. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. I didn't think about Lauren. Not yet. I forced myself not to jump ahead. Accusations without proof were exactly what Margaret had warned me against. Instead, I followed the money. I traced the withdrawals to their destinations. Some went to accounts I recognized: bills, utilities, medical expenses. Those were expected. Others went somewhere else. A name appeared repeatedly, an entity I didn't recognize, a consulting firm with a bland professional title that could belong to anyone. I typed it into my computer. The website was sparse, too clean. No real history, no listed team. Just a logo, a mission statement full of vague language, and a contact number. I frowned. I searched public records next. Corporate filings, addresses. The firm existed on paper, but only just. Registered recently. Minimal activity, no real footprint. A shell. Margaret had circled the name on one of the statements and drawn an arrow toward it. Beside it, she'd written, "Why them?" I added another page to my notebook and started a timeline. Dates of withdrawals, dates of Margaret's hospital visits, dates Lauren had helped with paperwork. The overlap was impossible to ignore. Every time Margaret was unwell, distracted, or exhausted, money moved. Not huge sums, just enough. Someone had been waiting for her to be vulnerable. My hands were steady as I worked. That surprised me. I'd expected anger, panic, some kind of emotional surge. Instead, I felt focused, clear, as if grief had finally sharpened into something usable. At the bottom of the stack, I found a document Margaret had flagged but not annotated. It was folded once the edges worn. I opened it carefully. A financial power of attorney. My name was printed at the top. My signature appeared at the bottom. I felt my pulse in my ears. I had never signed this. The authority granted was broad. Too broad. It allowed someone to make financial decisions on my behalf if I was deemed temporarily incapacitated. The designated agent was Lauren. I stared at the page until the words lost meaning. This wasn't about helping Margaret manage household affairs. This was about positioning. About preparing for a moment when I would be too broken to resist. If Margaret had died and I'd collapsed into grief the way everyone expected, Lauren would have had legal access to everything. Accounts, assets, decisions. She hadn't been rushing me to heal. She'd been rushing me to hand over control. A memory surfaced uninvited. Lauren standing in the kitchen after the funeral, her voice gentle but firm. "We should handle things now while it's easier." Easier for whom? I sat there for a long time, staring at the power of attorney. I imagined a version of myself who hadn't opened the suitcase. A man numbed by loss, grateful for someone else to take charge. A man who would have signed whatever was put in front of him just to make the noise stop. Margaret had seen that coming. She had known me well enough to know I'd need protection from my own grief. The fear came then. Not sudden, not overwhelming, but cold and precise. If Margaret had been an obstacle, what did that make me now? I pushed the thought away and focused on what I could control. I made copies of everything, digital and physical. I labeled files. I saved backups in places Lauren would never look. I returned the originals to the suitcase, restoring it to its hidden place behind coats and winter scarves. When I finished, the sun had shifted in the window. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't noticed the time passing. I stood and stretched my joints, protesting. The house felt different now, less hostile. Not safe, but understandable. That evening, Lauren came by briefly to drop off something she claimed I'd left at her house. She didn't stay long. She stood near the doorway, scanning the room with quick glances. "You look tired," she said. "You should rest." I smiled faintly. "I will." She nodded, satisfied, and left. I locked the door behind her and leaned against it, listening to my own breathing. She thought I was still guessing. She thought grief had made me slow. What she didn't know was that I had stopped asking why she was rushing me. I knew why now. And for the first time since Margaret died, I wasn't just surviving the days. I was preparing. I didn't sleep that night, but not because of grief. Sleep requires surrender. You have to believe nothing will change while you're gone. I no longer believed that. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe, cataloging sounds the way a stranger would. The refrigerator hum. The click of the heating system. The soft creak of floorboards settling. I realized something unsettling before dawn. Margaret hadn't just been afraid. She had been alert. And now that alertness had passed to me. I got up quietly and returned to my study, careful not to turn on the overhead light. I didn't want the house to look awake from the outside. That thought surprised me. It was the first time I'd considered how my actions might be observed. I opened my notebook and reviewed the timeline again. Withdrawals, appointments, forms. The shell company. Every arrow pointed in the same direction, but the picture was still incomplete. Lauren had help. The consulting firm was the key. I spent the early morning researching it properly this time. Not just the website, but corporate records, addresses, associated names. I followed the digital paper trail the way I'd once followed engine trouble back when I worked maintenance at the plant, slowly, patiently checking each connection twice. The firm's registered address led to a shared office space across town. The kind that rented mailboxes and conference rooms by the hour. No permanent staff, no signage. Just a legal footprint thin enough to exist, light enough to disappear. I found the name of the registered agent and wrote it down. Then I found another company tied to the same person. And another. Different names. Same structure. This wasn't Lauren improvising. This was infrastructure. By mid-morning, I had 3 names, 2 addresses, and a growing sense that I was standing on the edge of something wider than my family. The realization didn't make me panic. It made me cautious. I remembered Margaret's words. Don't confront her alone. I closed the laptop and forced myself to step away. The temptation to act immediately was strong. Anger always wants motion. But Margaret hadn't survived this long by acting on impulse. I made breakfast, toast, eggs. Ate slowly, deliberately, as if reminding myself that normal life still existed. When Lauren texted to say she'd be stopping by later to check on me, I replied with a simple thumbs up. The performance continued. Lauren arrived in the early afternoon, her smile already in place. She moved through the house with the same practiced familiarity, her eyes flicking toward corners, shelves, boxes. Have you thought more about what we discussed? She asked casually. About getting everything settled? I nodded. I have. Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. And I think I need more time. The smile tightened. I worry about you being alone with all this, she said. It's not good for your health. There it was. The concern, the implication, the soft pressure. I appreciate that, I said evenly, but I'm managing. She studied me for a moment, searching for weakness. Whatever she saw or didn't seem to satisfy her. She nodded and changed the subject, asking about dinner plans, about my son's schedule, about small safe things. I answered carefully, offered nothing, asked nothing. When she left, I watched from the window until her car turned the corner. Only then did I move. I drove across town an hour later, parking a block away from the shared office space listed on the firm's registration. I told myself I was just looking. Just observing. I stayed in the car, engine off, hands resting lightly on the wheel. People came and went. Couriers, freelancers, a woman carrying a laptop bag, a man in a suit talking animatedly on his phone. Then I saw Lauren. My breath caught. She wasn't alone. She stepped out of her car with a man I didn't recognize. Tall, well-dressed, confident in the way men are when they believe the world bends easily for them. They spoke briefly before entering the building together, close enough that his hand brushed her arm. I felt something shift inside my chest, cold and precise. This was the missing piece. I didn't follow them inside. That would have been foolish. Instead, I waited, watched, noted the time, the entrance they used. The way Lauren laughed at something he said, the tension I'd seen in her at home, absent, now replaced by ease. They emerged 40 minutes later. The man checked his watch. Lauren nodded. They parted without ceremony. No affection, no familiarity that suggested romance. This was business. I waited until Lauren drove away before I left. At home, I wrote everything down. Description, time, location. My hands were steady again. The fear was there, but it no longer controlled me. Margaret hadn't just suspected Lauren. She'd suspected a partnership. That evening, I returned to the financial records and searched again, this time for transfers that aligned with the dates I'd just witnessed. The connection was immediate. Funds moved within hours of Lauren's visits to that address. I stared at the screen, the implications unfolding slowly. This wasn't opportunism. It was orchestration. Someone had identified Margaret as a gatekeeper. Someone had recognized my grief as a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Lauren was the access point, not the architect. The thought made my stomach turn. If there was another person involved, someone more experienced, more detached, then the stakes were higher than I'd allowed myself to believe. People like that don't like loose ends. They don't like delays. They don't like widowers who start asking questions. I shut the laptop and sat in the dark. For the first time, I considered my own safety, not in a dramatic sense, not in fear of violence, but in the quiet awareness that I was no longer invisible. If Margaret had been monitored, then I might be too. I changed the locks the next morning. It was a small thing, practical. The kind of thing no one questions. When Lauren noticed the new hardware that afternoon, she raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" she asked lightly. "Just being careful," I said. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. That night, I hid the suitcase somewhere else. Not the closet. Somewhere Lauren would never think to look. As I finished, I stood in the center of the room and listened again to the house. The sounds were the same. The walls hadn't moved. The furniture hadn't shifted. But the balance had. Margaret had been right. The danger hadn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. It had arrived quietly, carrying concern and efficiency, hiding behind family. I turned off the light and went to bed fully aware that the game had changed. I was no longer just protecting the truth Margaret left behind. I was protecting myself. And whoever Lauren was working with had no idea that I had already seen them step into the open. I began pretending to be weaker than I was. It wasn't a conscious decision at first. It grew out of instinct, the same instinct that tells animals to play dead when predators are near. I stopped correcting Lauren when she spoke over me. I let my shoulders slump. I sighed more often. I let grief sit on my face like a mask instead of a wound. Lauren noticed immediately. "You look exhausted," she said one afternoon, her voice softening. "You really should let us handle more of this." I nodded slowly, as if the idea hadn't already occurred to me. "Maybe you're right." The relief that flashed across her face was quick but unmistakable. She thought she was winning again. From that day on, I changed my routines, not dramatically, just enough to look unsteady. I forgot appointments. I asked the same question twice. I let bills pile up on the counter where she could see them when she stopped by. Every performance needs an audience. Lauren stepped in eagerly. She began helping again, just as Margaret had documented. Offering to organize paperwork, suggesting she call banks on my behalf, asking gentle but pointed questions about what I could manage on my own. I gave her just enough access to feel confident. Inside, I was counting every move. I kept detailed notes after each interaction. The questions she asked, The files she wanted to see. The moments when her tone shifted from concern to irritation, when I hesitated. She didn't like resistance. She tolerated it only when it came wrapped in weakness. One evening, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded, eyes intent. "We should probably update some documents," she said, "just to make things easier, in case something happens." Something happens. I felt the words slide against me like a blade. "What kind of documents?" I asked, my voice deliberately uncertain. She named them casually. Financial authorizations, healthcare directives, things any responsible family would discuss, she said. Especially now. I nodded. "I'll think about it." Her jaw tightened. Thinking wasn't part of her plan. That night, I slept lightly, waking at every sound. I'd started checking doors twice, windows once more before bed. The locks I'd changed felt solid beneath my hands, reassuring in a way that had nothing to do with hardware. In the quiet hours, I replayed Margaret's notes in my head. The way her fear had grown slowly. The way she'd stayed outwardly calm while documenting everything. I understood her now, in a way I hadn't before. She'd been acting too. The next step came from necessity, not courage. I needed confirmation, not suspicion, not coincidence. Something solid enough to stand on when the time came. So I did something I hadn't planned to do yet. I followed Lauren. She told me she was going grocery shopping. I watched her leave from the window, counted to 30, then grabbed my keys and followed at a distance that felt safe. She didn't go to the store. She drove across town, taking the same route as before toward the shared office space. My hands tightened on the wheel as I parked a block away again. This time, I didn't stay in the car. I walked slowly toward the building, keeping my head down, my posture unremarkable. I stopped near a coffee shop across the street and sat by the window. Lauren arrived 10 minutes later. The same man joined her. They didn't go inside right away. They stood on the sidewalk talking quietly. I couldn't hear them, but I watched their body language. Lauren gestured sharply. The man listened, his expression cool, detached. When he spoke, she nodded, her shoulders dropping as if reassured. He placed a hand on her back, guiding her toward the entrance. Not affection. Ownership. My stomach churned. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. I had what I came for. Confirmation that this wasn't a solo act, that Lauren wasn't improvising out of panic or grief. She was reporting to someone. Back home, I sat in my study and stared at the wall for a long time before writing anything down. The truth had weight now. It pressed against my ribs, heavy and undeniable. Margaret hadn't been paranoid. She'd been cornered. The realization shifted something fundamental in me. I stopped thinking of Lauren as a family problem and started seeing her as a risk factor. Someone who made decisions based on advantage, not loyalty. People like that don't stop when they're challenged gently. They escalate. The following days confirmed it. Lauren grew bolder. She brought documents with her when she visited, papers already filled out except for signatures. She spoke more openly about next steps. She hinted at moving me closer to them, somewhere easier to manage. "I just worry about you being alone," she said, her concern now tinged with impatience. "It's not safe." Safe. The word landed differently now. I looked at her and saw what Margaret must have seen in those final weeks. Not a villain, something more unsettling. A person convinced they were entitled to decide other people's lives. I began to understand the timeline Margaret had marked so carefully. The pressure wasn't random. It had peaks and valleys. Moments of intensity followed by reassurance. Push, then soothe. Push, then reassure. Control disguised as care. That night, I removed the last thing Lauren might have used against me. I changed my medications, not because I thought she'd tampered with them yet, but because Margaret's notes had taught me not to wait for proof when prevention was possible. I spoke to my doctor, explained that I wanted everything documented, everything reviewed. He listened, asked questions, made notes. The system began to notice me. Lauren noticed too. "You've been distant," she said during her next visit. "Are you upset with me?" The question was a test. I shook my head slowly. "Just tired." She searched my face, then smiled. "I understand. We'll get through this." "We." The word echoed in my mind long after she left. I sat alone in the living room that evening, the lights off the house wrapped in shadow. For the first time since Margaret died, I felt something close to anger. Not explosive. Focused. Margaret had spent months protecting me without my knowledge. Now it was my turn to finish what she started. But not by confrontation, not by emotion, by patience. I picked up my notebook and wrote a single line across the top of a new page. "Let them believe you're already broken. Because when people think they've won, they make mistakes." And I was done being rushed, managed, or underestimated. The trap was forming. All I had to do was wait for Lauren to step fully into it. The first real fear didn't come with shouting or threats. It came quietly on an ordinary afternoon, when I realized how easily I could disappear without anyone asking the right questions. Lauren stopped by unannounced, carrying a paper bag from the pharmacy. She set it on the counter like it was nothing like it belonged there. "I picked these up for you," she said. "They said you were due for a refill." My stomach tightened. "I didn't ask for one," I said. She waved it off with a gentle laugh. "You didn't have to. I know what you take. That was the problem." Margaret had known exactly what she took too. She'd managed her medications meticulously, questioning every change, every dosage. I had trusted Lauren to help after Margaret fell ill. Trusted her because she was family. Now I looked at the bag and saw something else. Control. I took the bag and thanked her, letting my voice sound tired. After she left, I didn't open it. I set it in the cupboard and stood there for a long moment, listening to my own breathing. Margaret's notes surfaced again in my mind. She watches closely when Elias isn't around. I realized then that I was Elias now. That night I checked every bottle in the medicine cabinet against the list my doctor had given me. The labels matched. The dosages were correct. Nothing had been altered. Yet, the relief I felt was brief and hollow. Fear doesn't disappear just because it hasn't acted yet. It settles in and waits. The next morning I noticed the mail had been opened. Not all of it, just the envelope from my bank. It sat on the counter, slit neatly along the top, the statement folded inside as if someone had looked and put it back carefully. Lauren hadn't mentioned stopping by. I didn't confront her. I folded the statement and placed it where I'd found it, my hands steady, my thoughts racing. This was no longer just about money or documents. This was about access. I began to see the house differently after that. Not as a place of memories, but as a space with vulnerabilities. Doors, windows, cabinets, drawers, routines. I stopped leaving things out. I stopped assuming privacy. I stopped trusting the quiet. That afternoon, I drove to my lawyer's office for the first time. I hadn't planned to do it yet. Margaret's notes had suggested caution patience. But fear changes the calculus. It sharpens the need for protection. The lawyer was older than I expected, with tired eyes and a voice that carried the weight of long experience. He didn't interrupt as I laid out what I had: bank statements, forged signatures, notes, timelines. He didn't look surprised. When I finished, he leaned back and exhaled slowly. "This is serious," he said. "And it's not just civil." The word hung in the air between us. "Forgery, financial exploitation, undue influence," he continued. "And that power of attorney, that's particularly concerning." I swallowed. "What about my safety?" He studied me carefully. "Have there been changes to your medications? Pressure to isolate you? Attempts to control communication?" Yes, and yes, though I said only, "I think it's moving in that direction." He nodded. "Then you need to slow things down without alerting them. Preserve evidence, and most importantly, Don't be alone when you confront anyone. I thought of Margaret again. She had never confronted Lauren. She had documented, hidden, waited. I left the office with a plan that felt both reassuring and terrifying. Legal protections would be put in place quietly. Accounts flagged. Notifications rerouted. Authority clarified. Lauren would feel the change. She just wouldn't know why yet. That night, my son called. His voice was tense, edged with frustration. Lauren says you've been distant, that you're not taking care of yourself. I closed my eyes. I'm handling things, I said carefully. You don't sound like yourself, he replied. She's worried about you. Of course she was. I appreciate that, I said. But I need time. There was a pause, then a sigh. She's just trying to help Dad. Margaret had said those exact words to me once, mimicking my tone after I dismissed her concerns. I ended the call shortly after my chest aching in a way grief alone hadn't caused. This wasn't just Lauren against me. It was Lauren between me and my son. The isolation Margaret had feared was already taking shape. That night, I dreamed of the house empty. No furniture, no photographs, just walls and silence. I woke with my heart pounding, convinced for a moment that everything was already gone. I didn't sleep again after that. In the early hours, I moved the suitcase one final time, placing it somewhere no one would think to look. Not even me on a careless day. I copied the USB contents again and stored them separately. I memorized key account numbers. I wrote down the lawyer's instructions in a code only I would understand. Preparation became my anchor. Fear still came, but it no longer paralyzed me. Lauren noticed the shift. You've been locking doors, she said casually during her next visit. That's not like you. I shrugged. Margaret always liked things secure. The mention of her name landed like a stone between us. Lauren's eyes flicked away. I just don't want you to worry yourself sick, she said. I smiled faintly. Too late. She laughed uneasy and changed the subject. But the balance had shifted. I could feel it in the way she watched me now, the way her questions sharpened, the way her reassurance came faster, more insistently. She sensed resistance. What she didn't know was that fear had already done its work. It had forced me to see clearly. Margaret hadn't died suddenly. She had faded under pressure, under management, under the quiet erosion of autonomy. Whether that erosion had contributed to her death was a question I wasn't ready to answer yet. But I knew this. I would not fade quietly. I would not be rushed into decisions while my grief was still raw. And I would not let concern become a weapon again. As I lay in bed that night, the house silent around me, I understood something Margaret must have learned too late. The most dangerous people don't attack you. They take care of you. Until there's nothing left that's truly yours. I knew I couldn't do this alone the moment the lawyer stopped speaking and let the silence stretch. I had laid everything out on his desk in careful stacks: bank statements, copies of forged documents, timelines I'd built late at night while the house slept. I'd spoken calmly, deliberately, the way Margaret would have wanted. When I finished, I expected questions, clarifications, skepticism. Instead, he leaned back, folded his hands, and studied me as if weighing something far heavier than paperwork. This isn't a family dispute, he said at last. This is a pattern. The word landed hard. A pattern meant repetition, intent, design. It meant Margaret hadn't been unlucky or overly cautious. It meant someone had been moving pieces long before she died. I thought if I just understood it, I said, my voice quieter than I intended, I could handle it. He shook his head slowly. Understanding is the first step. Containing it is another matter. That was the moment I admitted what I'd been resisting. This had passed beyond what one grieving man could manage in silence. Every instinct in me wanted to keep it contained, to protect what remained of my family, to avoid turning my life into a public unraveling. But Margaret hadn't documented all of this, so I could hide it. She had documented it so it couldn't be buried. The lawyer asked careful questions. Who had access to the house? Who handled medications? Who spoke on my behalf when I wasn't present? Each answer tightened the knot in my chest. Have you noticed pressure, he asked. Subtle influence? Encouragement to make decisions quickly, I almost laughed. That's been constant. He nodded. Then timing matters. If we move too fast, they'll know. And if they know, evidence disappears. The thought chilled me. Lauren didn't strike me as reckless. She was efficient, patient. People like that didn't panic, they adapted. So what do we do, I asked. We set a net, he said. Quietly, the plan unfolded in stages, each one designed to look harmless on its own. Accounts flagged for unusual activity. Access adjusted without notification. Legal authority clarified but not announced. A financial freeze prepared, ready to deploy the moment we needed it. And you, he added, fixing me with a steady look, you continue exactly as you are. Weak, I said. Grieving, he corrected. Uncertain, alone. I nodded. I could play that part. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly the system would begin to move once we set it in motion. 2 days later, I received a notice from the bank confirming changes I hadn't requested, monitoring protocols, additional verification steps. It was subtle, wrapped in neutral language, but it was there. Lauren noticed it that afternoon. She called, her voice tight. Did you talk to the bank? I might have, I said, keeping my tone vague. Why? They flagged a transaction, she said. It's nothing serious, but it's inconvenient. Inconvenient. I pictured her on the other end of the line, already recalculating. I'm sorry, I said. I didn't realize. She paused, then softened. It's okay. I just worry about things getting complicated while you're like this. Like this. I hung up and sat very still, my heart pounding. The net was being felt. The lawyer warned me it would happen. When control begins to slip, people reveal themselves not all at once, but in flashes. A sharper tone, a shorter fuse, a sudden need to reassert authority. Lauren came by the next evening unannounced. She stood in the doorway scanning the house with quick, assessing glances. I tried to move some funds for your utilities, she said. It didn't go through. That's strange, I replied. Maybe I did something wrong. She stepped closer. You should let me handle it. The old me might have agreed. The man she thought I was would have handed over the problem gratefully. I think I'll call the bank tomorrow, I said instead. Her jaw tightened. That might confuse things, she said carefully. They'll ask questions. Isn't that their job, I asked. The silence stretched between us. I could almost hear the calculations happening behind her eyes. She smiled again, but the warmth was gone. Of course. I just don't want you stressed. After she left, I sat alone in the living room, the weight of the moment settling in. Margaret had been right to warn me. Pressure didn't always escalate loudly. Sometimes it sharpened, focused, searching for leverage. The next escalation came from somewhere I hadn't expected. My son called that night. Lauren says you've been making changes without telling her, he said, frustration edging his voice. She's trying to help you, Dad. Why are you pushing her away? The words cut deeper than I'd anticipated. I'm not pushing anyone away, I said. I'm taking responsibility for what, he snapped. You can barely get through the day. I closed my eyes. This was the risk Margaret had written about. Isolation through concern, undermining credibility, making me seem incapable so others could step in for my own good. I'm okay, I said quietly. I just need space. There was a long pause. I hope you know what you're doing, he said before hanging up. So did I. The lawyer called the next morning. They're testing boundaries, he said. That means we're close. Close to what I asked. Close to forcing a reaction. That reaction came sooner than expected. Lauren showed up the following afternoon with a stack of papers in her hand, her smile too bright, her voice overly calm. "I spoke to someone who can help us streamline things," she said. "It's just temporary, while you're grieving." I glanced at the top page. Another authorization, another request for access. "I'm not signing anything today," I said. Her smile vanished. "You don't understand," she said, the edge finally breaking through. "This is necessary." "For whom?" I asked. Her eyes flashed. "For all of us." I stood slowly, feeling my heart race, but my voice stayed steady. "I think you should go." For a moment I thought she might argue. Instead, she gathered the papers sharply and turned toward the door. "This isn't over," she said. I watched her leave, my hands shaking now that the moment had passed. That night I sat with the lawyer again, recounting every word. "She's overplaying her hand," he said. "That's good. It means she's feeling the pressure." "What happens next?" I asked. "We move," he said. "And when we do, it has to be complete." I looked at the photograph of Margaret on my desk, her smile familiar and steady. "I'm ready," I said. The net was no longer theoretical. It was tightening thread by invisible thread around a woman who believed she was still in control. And for the first time since Margaret died, I felt something solid beneath my feet. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was setting the trap. I set the room the way you would set a stage when you want every movement to mean something. The chairs were placed facing each other, not too close, not too far. The curtains were open just enough to let in late afternoon light, the kind that makes faces honest, whether they want to be or not. I cleared the table of everything, except 2 glasses of water and a thin folder I placed carefully in the center. Lauren arrived exactly on time. She paused in the doorway, scanning the room, her eyes lingering on the empty spaces where boxes had once been stacked. I could see her registering the changes, filing them away. "Hi," she said, forcing warmth into her voice. "You wanted to talk?" "Yes," I said. "Please sit." She did, crossing her legs, neatly folding her hands in her lap. Concern settled onto her face like a practiced expression. "I've been worried about you," she said. "You've seemed distant." I nodded slowly. "I've been thinking." She smiled. "That's understandable." I let the silence stretch. Lauren shifted, slightly uncomfortable now that I wasn't filling the space for her. "I wanted to understand what's been happening," I said finally. "With the accounts, the paperwork, all of it." Her eyes sharpened. "I've told you. I've just been trying to help." "I know," I said. "You've said that." I reached for the folder but didn't open it yet. Instead, I asked a question I already knew the answer to. "When did you first start managing Margaret's medications?" She blinked just once. "I didn't manage them. I just made sure she took what the doctor prescribed." "Which doctor?" I asked. She hesitated. "I don't remember." I nodded as if that made sense. "And the supplements you suggested?" "The ones that weren't on her chart." Her posture stiffened. She was tired. I thought they might help. I leaned back in my chair. "You thought?" Lauren's tone hardened slightly. "Elias, this is going nowhere. Margaret was sick. Things get complicated." "They do," I agreed. "That's why documentation matters." I slid the folder toward her, but still didn't open it. I wanted her to see it first, to feel its presence. "What's that?" she asked. "Something Margaret left behind." The color drained from her face before she could stop it. "She was confused," Lauren said quickly. "You know that?" "Toward the end." "Careful," I said quietly. She stopped. I opened the folder and pulled out a single page, placing it on the table between us. Not the worst document. Not the most damning. Just enough. "Do you recognize this?" I asked. Lauren glanced at it and then looked away. "It looks like financial paperwork." "It is," I said. "With my signature." She looked again, longer this time. Her mouth tightened. "That's your handwriting," she said. "It isn't," I replied. She laughed short and sharp. Elias, you're mistaken. I reached into the folder and laid an older document beside it, one I'd signed years ago. The difference was obvious when they sat side by side. Lauren stared at them in silence. You forged my name, I said calmly. Her head snapped up. That's a serious accusation. So is forgery, I said. For a moment she said nothing. Then her shoulders dropped slightly, as if she'd made a decision. You wouldn't have understood, she said. Margaret was controlling everything. You were barely functioning. The words hit harder than I expected. You mean grieving, I said. She waved a hand dismissively. Same thing. Someone had to step in, and that someone was you. Yes, she said, her voice firm now. Because I was capable. I studied her face. There was no shame there, no hesitation, just certainty. You were rushing me to make decisions, I said. To clear out the house. To sign documents. Why? She leaned forward. Because delay creates chaos. Because you were vulnerable. Because Margaret wouldn't let go. The name landed between us like a dropped plate. Margaret trusted me, she continued. She trusted me to protect the family when she couldn't. I felt something rise in my chest, sharp and burning, but I kept my voice steady. She trusted you, I said, and you exploited that. Lauren laughed again, louder this time. Exploited Elias, please. You're sentimental. That's your weakness. I closed the folder slowly. You spoke about Margaret like she was an obstacle, I said. She was, Lauren replied without hesitation. She slowed everything down. She questioned things that didn't need questioning. I stood then, unable to remain seated any longer. She was my wife, I said, and she was right. Lauren rose too, her eyes flashing. Right about what? About you. The silence stretched heavy and electric. You think you've won something, she said finally. But you don't even know who you're dealing with. I met her gaze. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. She smiled, cold and thin. You're alone in this. No, I said softly. I'm not. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. I stepped back and gestured toward the door. You should go. She hesitated, then straightened her coat, regaining composure. This conversation never happened, she said. I disagree, I replied. She left without another word. I stood there long after the door closed, my heart pounding, my hands trembling now that the mask had dropped. I hadn't needed a confession. I hadn't needed her to admit guilt. She had shown me everything I needed to see. That evening I sat alone in the dim light, the folder open in front of me. Margaret's handwriting visible on the top page. Lauren believed she had exposed my weakness. What she hadn't realized was that she'd just confirmed every fear Margaret had documented. The pretending was over. The next move wouldn't be mine alone. And Lauren had just walked away, believing she'd survived the confrontation. She hadn't. She had sealed it. The morning after the confrontation felt unnaturally calm. I woke before sunrise, the house wrapped in a pale blue quiet that made everything feel suspended, as if the world itself was holding its breath. For the first time in weeks, my chest didn't feel tight with confusion. There was no buzzing panic, no second guessing, just a steady awareness that something irreversible had already been set in motion. I made coffee and drank it standing by the window, watching the street slowly come alive. Neighbors left for work. A dog barked somewhere down the block. Ordinary life continued, indifferent to the fact that my own had crossed a line it could never step back over. By mid-morning, the phone rang. It was the lawyer. We're moving today, he said without preamble. Everything we prepared is being activated. I didn't ask what that meant. I already knew. Within hours, notifications began to arrive. Quiet ones. Emails written in neutral language. Alerts phrased as routine confirmations. Accounts placed under review. Temporary holds enacted. Authority clarified. The system didn't announce itself with sirens or raised voices. It simply shifted. Lauren felt it almost immediately. She called just after noon, her voice sharp and unsteady. "What did you do?" I sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. I followed advice. What advice she demanded? Professional advice. There was a pause, then a brittle laugh. "You went behind my back." "I went around you," I said. "There's a difference." Her breathing was audible now. "You don't understand what you've done." "I understand exactly what I've done." "You've complicated things," she said. "You've made everything harder than it needs to be. Harder for whom I thought." "I won't discuss this over the phone," I said. "If you have concerns, speak to your attorney." She hung up without another word. I sat there for a long moment after the call ended, the silence ringing in my ears. Margaret's face floated into my mind, not as she'd been at the end, but as she'd been years earlier, calm, composed, quietly decisive. This was what she'd been preparing for. That afternoon, the authorities became involved, not dramatically. No one knocked down doors or read rights aloud in my living room. It began with questions, polite, careful ones. A financial investigator requested documentation. A follow-up call asked about access to medications, to appointments, to personal correspondence. I answered honestly. I provided what I had. For the first time since Margaret died, I felt like someone was listening. By evening, the news reached my son. He arrived at the house unannounced, his expression tight with anger and disbelief. He stood in the doorway, hands clenched at his sides, as if afraid he might break something if he stepped fully inside. "What is going on?" he demanded. "Lauren says you accused her of crimes." "I didn't accuse her," I said. "I reported facts." "You've destroyed our family," he snapped. I felt the words land heavy and sharp. "No," I said quietly. "I refused to let it be destroyed quietly." He shook his head. "She was trying to help you." "So she said," I replied. "You're grieving," he said. "You're not thinking clearly." The accusation hurt more than I expected. Not because it was unfair, but because it echoed everything Lauren had been implying for months. I stood and met his gaze. "I am thinking more clearly now than I have since your mother died." He looked away, jaw working. "You didn't even talk to me." "Neither did she," I said gently. Silence filled the space between us, thick and uncomfortable. "She's being investigated," he said finally, his voice dropping. "Do you know what that does to someone?" "Yes," I said. "I do." He stared at me, searching my face for hesitation, for regret. He found neither. "I won't stop this," I said. "Not for you. Not for anyone." He swallowed hard. "Then I don't know who you are anymore." The words hurt, but they didn't break me. "I'm the man your mother trusted," I said. "That hasn't changed." He left without saying goodbye. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the lights off the house, lit only by the glow from the street outside. I listened to the sounds of it settling the same house that had once felt like a refuge, then like a trap. Now, it felt like a witness. 2 days later, I received confirmation that the investigation into Margaret's finances had expanded. The forged documents, the unauthorized withdrawals, the shell company, everything Margaret had flagged was now part of an official record. And then came the part I'd both anticipated and dreaded. The question of Margaret's death. No one accused Lauren outright, not yet. But her involvement in Margaret's care, her access to medications, the timing of certain changes, it all warranted closer examination. The past was being reopened. When I was informed that Lauren's home had been searched, I felt no satisfaction, only a hollow ache where family loyalty used to live. I didn't attend. I didn't watch from a distance. I stayed home and sat at Margaret's desk, running my fingers over the grooves her pen had worn into the wood over decades. She'd lived here, loved here, and quietly fought here. By the end of the week, charges were filed. Financial fraud, forgery, abuse of trust. The words looked stark and impersonal on the page, stripped of emotion, stripped of context. They didn't capture the slow erosion, the manipulation disguised as care, the way family had been weaponized against itself. But they were enough. Lauren tried to contact me once more. A message left on my phone, her voice trembling now, stripped of certainty. "Elias," she said, "please, we need to talk." I didn't respond. That wasn't cruelty. It was necessity. Some conversations don't bring clarity. They only reopen wounds. In the quiet days that followed, I took stock of what it had cost me. I had lost my wife. That grief would never fully leave me. I had lost my son, at least for now. That pain sat differently heavier in some ways because it was still unfolding. And yet I hadn't lost myself. Margaret's name had been cleared, her concerns validated, her quiet resistance brought into the light. Lauren believed she could take everything from me by positioning herself as indispensable. What she hadn't understood was that Margaret had already chosen what mattered most: the truth. I stood by the window again one evening, watching the street settle into night, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, relief. The kind that comes when the ground stops shifting beneath your feet, even if the landscape around you is forever changed. Margaret had been right. Some battles aren't won by shouting. They're won by refusing to look away. The house was quieter than it had ever been, and for the first time that silence didn't feel like punishment. I woke before dawn, as I had most mornings since Margaret died. But instead of the familiar weight pressing on my chest, there was something else. Space. Not emptiness space. The kind that comes after a storm has finally passed and left the air clean, even if the ground is still scarred. I made coffee and sat at the small kitchen table, the same one where Margaret used to read the paper every morning, circling articles she wanted to talk about later. I could almost see her there, glasses slipping down her nose, brow furrowed in concentration. "You were right," I said aloud, my voice barely more than a whisper. The legal process moved forward without me needing to chase it. Statements were taken, documents were reviewed. Experts confirmed what Margaret had suspected long before I was ready to hear it. The narrative that had once painted Lauren as the dutiful caretaker unraveled thread by careful thread. Nothing dramatic, no shouting, just facts. And facts, I learned, are far more powerful than anger. The hardest part wasn't watching Lauren face consequences. It wasn't even the quiet knowledge that she had tried to erase Margaret's presence from this world piece by piece. The hardest part was my son. Weeks passed before he contacted me again. When he did, it was a short message. No accusations, no apologies. Just a single sentence. "I don't know how to live with this." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "Neither do I," I wrote back. "But we'll have to learn separately." It wasn't the ending I had imagined when Margaret and I raised him. It wasn't the family future we had planned. But pretending otherwise wouldn't bring her back, and it wouldn't heal anyone. Some fractures don't mend. They settle. On a quiet afternoon, I finally opened the last envelope Margaret had left behind. It wasn't filled with instructions or warnings, just a short note written in her steady hand. "If you're reading this, then you survived the truth. I'm proud of you for that. Don't let bitterness take root where clarity now lives. Choose peace even if it costs you people you love." I folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the drawer. Peace didn't mean forgiveness. It didn't mean forgetting. It meant no longer letting someone else's choices dictate the shape of my remaining years. I sold the house 3 months later. Not because it held bad memories, but because it held too many good ones. I needed a place where I could remember Margaret without feeling like I was trapped inside a museum of our life together. The new place was smaller, quieter. Sunlight poured through the windows in the afternoon, warming the floors. I planted herbs on the balcony because Margaret always said fresh basil made everything better. Some habits don't disappear when the person does. On the anniversary of her death, I visited the cemetery alone. No speeches, no flowers arranged for effect. Just me standing there with my hands in my pockets, breathing in the cool air. "I did what you asked," I said. And I didn't lose myself doing it. A strange sense of closure settled over me then. Not happiness, not relief. Acceptance. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but stays. In the months that followed, people began reaching out. Quiet messages from strangers who had heard parts of my story. Men and women who had ignored warning signs because love made them hopeful and fear made them silent. I answered every message I could. Not as an expert, not as a hero, just as someone who learned too late that trust doesn't mean blindness and love doesn't mean surrendering your instincts. Margaret had tried to tell me. I didn't listen when it was easy, but I listened when it mattered, and that made all the difference. Now when I sit in the evenings with the window open and the city humming softly outside, I don't feel like a victim of what happened. I feel like a witness to how easily manipulation hides behind concern, to how family can become the most dangerous place when boundaries disappear, and to how strength sometimes shows up only after everything familiar has fallen apart. If you're still here, still listening to this story, I want you to hear this part clearly. If someone you love pressures you to forget, to rush, to erase pieces of your life before you're ready, pay attention. If your instincts whisper that something isn't right, don't silence them just to keep the peace. And if someone you trust tells you they're afraid, don't dismiss it, because facing the truth feels uncomfortable. I learned that lesson too late for Margaret, but maybe it doesn't have to be too late for someone else. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever ignored a warning sign about someone close to you? Or noticed something felt off but couldn't explain why? Share your experience in the comments. Sometimes one story gives another person the courage to speak. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about family betrayal, resilience, and the quiet strength it takes to choose truth, consider subscribing and staying with the channel. These stories aren't just about the past, they're about what we do next. Thank you for listening.